Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Steph from Simply Rhino and I'd like to welcome you to this, our third webinar in our series focused on the use of VRay 2 for Rhino. This third webinar will examine the material system in VRay for Rhino. The principles of creating a material from scratch will be introduced, and among the elements we will examine are diffuse colour, reflectivity, reflection highlight, the importance of the Fresnel filter, transparency, refraction, controlling texture mapping in Rhino, bump, displacement and Toon cartoon materials. The webinar will last approximately 30 minutes and our presenter is Phil Cook. Phil is an experienced product design professional and senior trainer here at Simply Rhino. He is responsible for our advanced and bespoke training. We do of course supply this software, Rhino, VRay for Rhino and all other key plugins for Rhino. We are one of the leading suppliers of these tools in the world. This success is mainly due to our depth of product knowledge. You will find that we only sell products we can support to an expert level. This focus makes us different. We offer training too, both tailored project or company-specific workshops and also public scheduled classes throughout the year, and we'll be very happy to hear from any of you with any Rhino-related software or training requirements. The fourth webinar in the series, Architectural Exterior, is on Wednesday the 15th of October. More details on what we intend to cover are on the webinar series page of the Simply Rhino website. Registration will open soon. This webinar is being recorded so you can watch it again. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. We will update everyone as soon as it's available to view. As we progress through today's presentation, please type any questions you may have and send to us. You may have an answer directly within the chat or it may be shared with the group later. There will be an official Q&A session following the software presentation. Lastly, I'd like to say a quick thank you to Chaos Group, Scan Computers and PMY for their assistance. So that's all for me from now. I'm going to hand over to Phil for the presentation. So Phil, hopefully you're there and over to you.
Thank you very much. Morning everybody. I'm Phil from Simply Rhino and today we are going to take a quick look at using our material system in VRay for Rhino. Now, those of you that have seen the previous webinars will have seen that VRay now comes with a VRay Express plugin, which is loaded here at the bottom of my screen, and that actually does have quite a comprehensive materials library. But I wanted to go just a little bit beyond using pre-built materials and just explain a little bit about how the material system works inside of VRay for Rhino. So if we were to take a fairly standard scene at pretty much default settings inside of VRay for Rhino and do a render, we would see that we have no materials applied by default. So let's look first of all at creating a material from scratch and looking at the diffuse color and also how we control reflections. So the material editor is accessed by clicking on the M symbol here in the VRay toolbar, and one thing that may be different to other softwares is that the material editor doesn't have direct access to a library. So you don't see a series of materials inside the material editor. You need to actually either create or load a material. So you can load a material from a library, you can load a collection of materials from a folder, or you can create a new material from scratch. Now there are a number of materials types that we can create in VRay for Rhino, and we're going to just look first of all at the standard material. Now the standard material in VRay for Rhino is a layered material. I can double click here to change the name of the material, just call this test, and if I expand the material here, you'll see it has a diffuse layer and it also has an option and a map layer here as well. So first of all, the diffuse color controls the base color of the material. By default, when you create a new material in VRay, it will be a mid-grey material with no reflection layer. So if I click on the colored square here in the Diffuse tab, I can change the color of the material. You can see the material actually preview in the materials browser here, and you can either have a live preview or you can disable the live preview and only update this preview when you actually want to see any material changes. Most materials in VRay, or nearly all materials, will have some sort of reflection to them. So we need to apply the reflection as a separate layer. So I right-click on my test material here, go to Create Layer, and I create a reflection layer. By default, the reflection layer is set to a highlight value of 1 and a reflection value of 1 in this glossiness section here. And these values control the specular highlight and the reflective quality of the material. And you can think of the reflection layer as like a clear coat that's applied over the diffuse material. The concept of having layered materials in Rhino is that the layer above needs to have some element of transparency or opacity, yes, transparency, so that you can see the layer underneath. Okay, so that's a fairly important concept, and it will be a very similar concept to building layers in Photoshop, for example, where you want to have layers with some transparency to them. So when we apply a material, it has a fully reflective shine and reflectiveness to it at a value of 1. And the range that we can use here is a very small range, somewhere between about 0.5 to 1 here. If I set both of these to 0.5 and allow this to preview, you can see that my material is almost completely diffuse. When I set this to a value of 1, then I've got a full reflection on the material, and the reflection is completely glossy. As well as controlling the reflection with just these values of the specular highlight and the reflection glossiness, I should point out, by the way, that when the specular highlight is set to 1, the highlight encompasses the whole of the object that we are applying the material to. So it's only when you start to reduce these values that you'll actually see more fully the contribution of the specular highlight. Okay, I'm going to set these to just back to 1 for the moment, and I'm going to look at another feature here. Let me first just apply these materials to the spheres here. So I apply materials in VRay by picking the objects and then right-clicking on the material in question and applying the material to the selection. Then when I render, I'll see the effect of those materials. Now, in this render here, we've got an HDR image in the background so that we can see the effect of the reflections. Now, a key feature of reflections and how they work inside of VRay is a filter component called the Fresnel filter. Now, Fresnel reflections are a real physically correct phenomena, and they essentially control how the reflection and what you see of the base diffuse material, how that changes when you go from either the perpendicular or the parallel position in terms of your viewport to the material. Okay, to just explain a little more, if I was to remove the Fresnel filter from the standard material here, and I preview again, you'll see that my reflection becomes really like a mirror. Because without the Fresnel filter, all we see is the reflectivity here, and we don't see any of the diffuse color. So the Fresnel filter controls the change in the reflection as we effectively walk around the material, or as we look at see the material from different angles. So the reflection, the Fresnel filter, is actually enabled by default. But a key component of it is this index of refraction here. Okay, and we can use that index of refraction to control essentially how hard the material appears. So let's do a little test here and have some materials which have the same reflection glossiness but a different index of refraction in the Fresnel filter to show that we can simulate different materials. So what I'm going to do is to duplicate my test material twice here, and in my first example of the material I'm going to set my index of refraction to 1.4, and I'm going to apply the material to the selection here. In my test 2 material, I'm going to use exactly the same highlight and reflection glossiness, but I'm going to set the index of refraction to let's say 1.8, and then I'm going to apply this material, and then in my test 2 material I'm going to use an IOR of 2.2 and apply this to the selection. This is an exercise, by the way, that I always get wrong. I always apply the materials in the wrong order, so let's have a look how on form I am today. Okay, that doesn't look too bad. So what we should be able to see here is that although our 3 materials actually have the same highlight and reflection glossiness, we can actually make these materials look progressively harder as we're going left to right by changing that index of refraction in the reflection layer. So this again is a physically correct way of being able to control how the material appears. So we can, in simple terms, create something that looks like a sort of a fairly soft plastic material to a harder plastic material to maybe something here that looks more like a ceramic material. Okay, so with 3 very simple values here, the highlight glossiness, the reflection, the specular highlight level, the reflection glossiness, and the Fresnel filter, we can kind of create an awful lot of different variations in our material. Okay, next concept that we need to be aware of in VRay materials is that the transparency is controlled by a grayscale value. So if in our diffuse layer we have a black in here for the transparency setting, then our material will be completely opaque. And if we make this white, it will be completely transparent. And if we use a mid sort of tone material here, then we'll have some transparency to that material, as you can see here. But using a transparency setting here isn't really a correct way of making either glassy materials or making transparent plastic materials or translucent plastic materials. Let's look essentially at how we might do a very simple glass material. And once again, all these materials are actually here for you in VRay Express, but I just wanted to try and explain a little about how these materials are created. So here we have a very simple scene with a couple of simple cups here. Now, one of the important things to consider when you render glass materials is that the environment, the reflective environment and the lighting is very important. And here we have got a very simple scene, so our glass is probably going to be less than exciting here, but it's a simple test to show you how to create these materials. So again, if I go to my material editor here and I bring in a new material, so I create a standard material, I'll call this material Simple Glass. Okay, and we first of all need to make our material transparent. Then we need to apply a reflection layer. You see the material starting to appear here. And then crucially, we need to apply a refraction layer. Okay, so refractions in simple terms are the internal reflections and how the light bends as it moves through the material. Again, in VRay we can use physically correct values to determine how the light passes through a transparent or translucent material. So we can create physically correct glass, physically correct crystal, physically correct diamond, etc. by controlling the index of refraction. The refraction layer appears down here, and pretty much we've created now a fairly basic glass material. So let's apply that material, do a quick test render, and then we'll look at a couple of ways, just very quick things we can do to vary and improve the material. Okay, so we've got, glass here which looks okay. One of the issues here is we don't have a very interesting reflective environment, but another more pressing issue is the fact that although the glass is transparent, or because the glass is transparent, we can hardly see very much of the glass that's going on here. So what we might choose to do is in our refraction color here is just to put a very small grayscale value here. Not too much, otherwise the glass will become noticeably grey. And another thing that we can do to improve the quality of the glass is to actually trace more refractions. And we can do this with our max depth value here in refractions. So let's maybe set that to 8. I'll do a little render window here. Okay, so I was just making a basic glass material here. So let's do this one more time, and just so we create a standard material, we make it transparent. It's better call this Simple Glass. Okay, that. We add a reflection layer, and we add a refraction layer, and the two areas that I was up to before, where I said we could improve the material, just to make the glass the refractions in the glass slightly darker, was to use a very kind of pale grayscale value in here for the refraction color, and then in our refraction options here to increase the maximum depth here. So just going to apply this material here, and we'll try and render again and hope for the best. And okay, that's good, we're rendering something again now. Okay, so we should see now, obviously it's hard to compare this because we lost the previous session. We should see now that the glass is slightly darker. We can now see more going on in this lip here as well, because we've increased the number of bounces of our refractions from 5 to 8, so we're calculating more refractions. And you can see here that extra bit of color or slight bit of grayscale in the glass has improved this. Now, of course, to make the glass come completely alive here, we need to use a really nice reflective environment and set up our lighting correctly. Now, of course, that sort of thing takes a bit of time, and this is, you know, one of the aspects that we cover in our training. Now, one of the questions that we've been asked on some of the previous sessions is about the cartoon material. So let's just quickly have a look at how a cartoon material might work. A cartoon material requires a base material and then you apply an outline to it. So I'm going to create a new material here, a new standard material, and I'm going to call this material white. Okay, and I'm going to make this material nearly white, and I'm going to create a reflection layer and just reduce this value to about 0.7 here. So my white material looks like this. That's going to be the base material for my cartoon material. Now I'm going to create another material, which is my Toon material. And you'll see in here we have some parameters for the line color, line width, and also a slot here to load in a base material. Okay, so we can control the line width in pixels here, and we can also have a multiplier for the silhouette. So the silhouette can be slightly wider than the other lines that we're seeing. So I'm going to apply the cartoon material, and we're going to render again. And what you'll see is that Rhino renders the white material first of all, then it puts the cartoon outline on the material. So if I increase the line width here, just to and increase the multiplier, we should see here that we get a slightly thicker outline. Okay, so VRay always renders those lines in the final pass of the render, so you won't see them in the pre-calculation. So basically, that's how a cartoon material works. Now, the nice thing about the cartoon materials is that if you want to, for example, have a scene with real materials in it, physically correct materials, you can still use those as a basis for the cartoon material. So in this instance here, if we were rendering some glasses, we could, and we wanted to draw a customer's attention to a particular shape in a series of glasses, we could use a cartoon material with glass as the base material, just so the customer is sure which glass that we are talking about in a particular instance. So the cartoon materials, although they're quite simple in how they are constructed, are really very useful. Okay, moving on, I'd like to just talk about how we might use textures in lieu of a diffuse color, and also how we might apply bump and displacement mapping. Okay, so here we've got just a simple cube with no materials applied. I'm going to create a new basic standard material here, and I'm going to create a reflection layer. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to apply an image map in lieu of the diffuse color. So to do this, I click on the M symbol, which is next to the diffuse color, and I choose texture bitmap, and I go to my appropriate texture map folder here, and I'm going to use this map here, which is a color map of some tiles. That's the map here, and I don't need to do anything with the mapping here. Again, we can add lots of complexity into mapping here, but we're keeping things pretty simple. in this session. You'll see once I've applied that map, this map effectively overwrites the diffuse color here. Now, one of the things that's important to understand in Rhino is that when you apply a VRay material, the mapping of that material is actually controlled inside of Rhino. So to do this, we use the VRay mapping widget here. We've got various styles of mapping here. At the moment we're using box mapping to control how this texture is mapped onto the sphere, and the idea of using box mapping, for example here, or any of these mapping widgets, is that the mapping widgets give us a means to scale and rotate textures. So if I scale the mapping widget here, you'll see that my size of my texture changes. Likewise, if I rotate the mapping widget here, then my texture rotates. Now, the mapping widgets now in Rhino 5 are actually pretty good, and we can also unwrap materials, and we can create custom mapping as well, which is really useful. And again, we don't really have the time in this sort of webinar to go into that, but we cover this in depth in our training sessions. So let's just have a quick look at this material here, and do a very quick test render. Okay, you can see that we have a material. Okay, it looks like tiles, but it doesn't really have any kind of impression of depth to these tiles. So where we've got grouting going on here, we don't really have any impression of depth. So we can look at this in two ways. We can either use what's called bump mapping, or we can use what's called displacement mapping. So let's look at the idea of bump mapping first of all. So again, I'll go to my material selection, and in my tile material here, at the bottom of my standard material here, I'll have a map section here, and this is where I can apply a bump map. Again, I click on the M symbol here, and I go to text bitmap, and depending on the type of map you use, if you use particular file types, then you can use the color map to actually, in lieu of a bump map. Here I'm going to use a separate grayscale map, and the idea with the bump map is that the lighter areas on the map will appear to be slightly higher, and the darker areas on the map will appear to be slightly lower. This is a faked effect, and it's done by lighting. Okay, very much like using hard light in Photoshop, for example. Okay, so key thing here is that we want to match the mapping of the bump map to the mapping of the color map. Okay, and we can set an amount of bump mapping here. I'm going to use a value of about 2.5 for this, and then I'm going to do another test render. And what we should see now is that we have now got an impression of depth here, particularly on this side and on the top. You can see that this starts to look much more realistic. However, if you were to look at the back edge of this, you'll see that it's actually straight, and you can see that really this is just a kind of an effect. We're not actually physically moving any pixels here to do this. So we're doing this by lighting. So we're effectively kind of creating this impression of depth by using the bump map to work with the lighting that's going on in the scene. If we want to actually move the pixels and create and physically move these values here, then we can use what's called displacement. And I'm going to use exactly the same bitmap for this, exactly the same mapping, and I'll use the same value here. Now this value here, when we use displacement, will be in scene units, and the idea is the black values on the bitmap will stay where they are, and the white bits will be raised up by 2.5 millimeters. So what we should see here, if I've done things correctly, is we should see these tiles actually starting to grow slightly. So the idea of displacement maps is that they are what is called dynamic geometry inside of VRay. So the calculations are loaded into each render bucket. Okay, so you can see now that if I zoom in here, that we're actually physically moving these polygons now. So what happens is the VRay takes the render mesh that's created and it recalculates the render mesh and starts to push out these tiles. Now, I'm going to just quickly do something which is a little more over the top here, but if you imagine that what we had was some very simple geometry and we wanted to maybe map or create something of the effect of, let's say, a dry stone wall, then we can do this with simple geometry and a displacement map set at a higher value, and we can start to really grow this geometry on the fly. Now, this looks fairly ridiculous in terms of being on a tiled surface, but you can see here if this was something like bricks or a dry stone wall, then it's a very, very efficient way of being able to create that geometry purely at render time. We can control essentially how tightly the displacement is calculated, so that if we've got something that's really close to the camera, then we can control that and make it look very good. The idea really here is that if you compared bump and displacement, in very simple terms, you'd use displacement on objects that were close to the camera and bump on objects that were further away, where you only wanted to give an impression of the depth. Okay, now finally, if we've got time for this, I just want to look at another question that we've been asked quite a lot about, and that is the matte shadow material. And this is a way of either achieving a backdrop inside of Rhino and getting shadows to appear on the backdrop, and we can also use this for a white studio scene as well. So again, we can use exactly the same way of doing this. Here we've got a scene, and we've got a Rhino wallpaper in here, and if I hide my ground plane in VRay, or my surface in VRay, you'll see this is the image that we're going to use here, and we've put it in to Rhino as a wallpaper image so that we can see the placement here. Okay, now I should point out some thanks here to Fernando from Chaos Group in the US for supplying this file. Normally our files aren't quite as good as this, so thank you, Fernando, for this one. If we were to just do a render of this scene as it is, we'd see something like this. Okay, we've got a dome light here, and the dome light has an HDR image in it, which is a spherical image of this scene that we're using as a backplate. And so we see the effect of the spherical projection in the background of the dome light, and we see our ground plane here. So what we need to do here is a couple of things. First of all, in our dome light, we need to make sure that the dome light is invisible. So we will then see the background that's in our environment. Okay, so if I go to my VRay options and my environment tab, you'll see that I've turned off my skylight here, and my background is the default black background. So what I'm going to do is apply an image here. Now, very often when you obtain commercial HDRs, you not only get the spherical map, but you get a series of backplates as well. And it's one of those backplates that I'm going to load in here. So I choose texture bitmap, I go to my appropriate folder, and I pick my background from here. Okay, and there are a couple of things that I need to do here. I need to change the mapping type to environment, but rather than having a spherical projection here, I need to choose screen projection here. Okay, this will effectively put my equivalent of the Rhino wallpaper into my VRay background. Okay, so if we were to render again, I'll just render quickly, but I'll probably stop the render. What we'll see now is that the background now should be in exactly the same projection as it is in my Rhino viewport, but we're still, of course, seeing this ground plane. Just going to do one quick thing in my environment here. Okay, just to make that background less bright. And let's look what we do with this ground plane material here. So essentially this is one of the pre-built materials that we can use in VRay Express here, and it's called a wrapper material. And we apply that material here. Just check that that material has been applied in. And the wrapper material actually uses two materials, again, in a similar sort of method that the cartoon material does. And it allows the floor to effectively be transparent but still catch shadows. So now if I render this scene, what we should see is our helicopter sitting on the road. The surface that we're using to describe the floor actually drops out, but we still see the shadows actually on that surface. So we can use this either for creating scenes like this, where you might do, for example, a car, or in this case a helicopter inside an environment. The important thing here, of course, is that you want to use the same spherical HDR that is in of the same context as your background image, and then you'll see that we can catch the shadows underneath this image now. And of course, we can change how those shadows are affected in the detail settings of the wrapper material. Okay, but pretty much this wrapper material is set up straight from VRay Express now. And if you are doing a white studio environment, you can use the wrapper material in a white environment, and you can get all your background to be white other than the shadows. So pretty much that's what I wanted to cover today. Sorry we've overrun a little, but as you no doubt noticed, we had a little technical difficulty in the middle of the webinar. So I'll hand you back to Steph and Paul.
Hello, Phil.
Hi.
Hello there. Right, we've got some questions, so I'm going to bring Paul on to introduce those, and
Okay.
And then Paul can do the wrap up as well. And thank you, Phil, for working out that technical hitch.
Okay, no worries.
Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've got about 4 or 5 questions here. If there are people still sending through questions now, I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to get to them. But do please feel free to email any additional questions to Steph. I think all of you would have her email addresses from the confirmations that you'd have received for attending the webinar. But anyway, so let's make a quick start on some of these. A question that came in quite early, Phil, from, I believe, Vin. This is the question. With the first concept, the Fresnel values,
Yeah.
what is the difference between the ROI and the refract ROI?
Okay, that's if you've got a clear material, then that's another way of controlling the index of refraction. So you've got, I'm not explaining that very well, but essentially for solid materials you use the upper of the two values, which is the ROI value.
Okay. And of course, if any of these questions aren't,
yeah, we can probably
you can come back to us with additional questions if anyone has anything. Feel free to email Steph with those questions, and we will get back to everybody. Okay. Second question: is it correct to make a mirror by just removing the Fresnel layer? That's a question from Rob.
You can do it that way, yes, or you can just turn up the IOR value in the Fresnel filter to a pretty high value, and that has the same effect.
Okay.
Okay. So what you might do for a mirror that's less than perfect is to use a high value and then some other factors going on underneath that, so you would effectively see a little bit less than a full-on completely reflective material.
Okay. Okay, and from Luke, who's asked some questions on some previous webinars as well. It's asking a question about creating partially dirty material. So you can imagine the sort of stains on a lower part of a concrete wall, that sort of thing.
Yes.
How would you approach that?
Well, you can do that in the standard material, and you can also do that in the other VRay compact material as well. And you can do that a number of ways, but you can do it with 2 diffuse layers, for example, with some transparency, and the partially dirty areas are seen through a transparency map. But there are, even more kind of complex ways of creating that material where you can have different reflections on these different areas as well. But effectively, you use it by enabling a transparency map in the material, so that you have, for example, 2 diffuse materials, a clean one and a dirty one, and then the transparency map, which is a bitmap image that you can either create, or you could use a generated bitmap. A generated texture, such as a noise or a dirt texture inside of VRay. These are procedural textures which are just calculated on the fly. And there's plenty of those textures now that you can use, and you can use those to effectively mask out areas of the material, so that you can see the dirt below the clean material, or indeed the other way around if you want to do it that way around.
Okay. Question from Simon: what is the difference between standard and VRay material when making a new material?
Okay, well, the VRay material is a new material that is coming in VRay 2.0, and that's effectively all of the layers of the VRay standard material inside one compact material. You'll notice that if you've got VRay Express, that most of those materials are actually the new VRay material. But you can also bring in that VRay material as a layer, and it's, let me just show you where that is here. If you go to Create Material and Standard here, you can bring in that new material as a VRay BRDF layer. And in fact, this is a really interesting way of creating materials, because this allows you to do not only the things that you can do inside of the complex layered material, but also some extra things that you can do in the VRay BRDF material. The other differences are that essentially the layered material, so the VRay standard material, essentially uses the concept of transparency, whereas the BRDF material uses a concept of opacity. So the way that you set up things and the way the materials is set up from standard is slightly different. But the good thing is that you can mix and match both of these. So the reason that this material exists, the VRay material, is because it's a simpler material definition, and it allows a better way of having cross-platform materials. So now, for example, inside of Max, you can save the materials out as a VRay for Rhino material, and it's that VRay material that's used to do that.
Okay, but you need 2.0 in order to do any of this. Yes,
that's a new material description in 2.0, yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, next question. Do high displacement values impact on render times? It's a question from Rob.
Yes, they do. Displacement is computationally, I should say, intensive, and so yes, any displacement impacts on render time. So again, there are a few strategies you can use to mitigate against that. You can set the render bucket size to be slightly smaller than it is by default, but it's important that you don't make it too small. Then you're only loading up a certain amount of displacement at a time, which can speed up a material. And you need to be careful how you control the displacement as well. And there are global controls and per material controls for this.
Okay, Rob also asked if it's possible to describe more about the details sessions. I think what Phil means there, Rob, is the training classes, is that Phil goes into a lot more detail on these issues on our classroom classes, which the next one's coming up on the 6th and 7th of October in London. Now, I know that for many of you on this webinar, these classes are not exactly accessible because you're from all areas of the world, but I think that's what he was referring to. Is that correct, Phil?
Yes, that's right,
yeah.
Because obviously we're limited to what we can cover here, whereas we have 2 days in the classroom classes to talk about these things in a little more detail.
Okay, now just a couple more questions I'm going to try and get to. What is the use of UV noise and UV info in the bitmap application?
Okay, so I guess you mean, let's have a look.
That's from Karina.
Okay. Let's have a look. Okay. Not sure where she means in here. Does she mean inside of?
One might be
does
tricky.
she mean the text noise here? If she means text noise, then that is a procedural texture to generate like a speckled noise texture, and if you set this very small, you can use it to create like a sparked finish on a plastic, or if you set it to large, you can use it to, for example, control displacement or bump on a water material.
Okay, now 2 questions, and we'll take these 2 as the last 2, and I'll probably combine them. But first was, how can I erase a material layer? And the other question is, when layering materials, how do you know which layer is on top? I thought perhaps you could look at those 2 together.
Yeah, sure. Well, so if we look at a material here, let's have a look, a default material here, and let's create a new layer here, create layer reflection. So you know which layer's on top because of the order it appears in the stack here. In earlier versions of VRay, the layers had to be in a particular order, but now you can move the material layers about. So I've just moved the reflection layer underneath the diffuse layer. And how you remove a layer is that you just right-click on it and remove layer. Simple as that.
Okay. Did that deal with both questions there? Erasing and layering?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, great. Okay. I think we'll have to call it a day there. So thank you very much, Phil. Thank you, Steph, for your organisation with this. And I'll just say we are recording this, and it will go in the usual place. There's a link you'll find off our home page. You can get to the previous 2 webinars. This one will be up there as soon as we can organise that. So thank you, everybody. And maybe just a last date, 15th of October is the date of the our 4th webinar, which addresses architectural rendering. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.